So, welcome back. After learning about loops, we now turn to functions. Functions are basically built for tasks we do repeatedly to some extent, but not in the sense like loops where we always do a certain operation 100 times in a row, one after each other, another directly, but more in the sense that sometimes we need it, and when we need it, we usually would have to program and code it, but with a function which is available, we can just call the function where we need those operations, and then those operations are applied at a point in the code where we call the function. And so functions help us to do a couple of things. So first of all, they help us to organize the code because we could just print it out and then we have line after line after line after line of operation in a certain order which they need to be applied. So we would repeat ourselves all the time and it would have many operations and it would be kind of not easy to read. So that's why we use functions where we say, okay, this line of code comes in that function, that line of code comes in that function, and then we call those functions in the order we want to without having to read all the lines of codes in the function because the functions already help us to identify what will be done. For example, I don't know, we could make a function call with the name writing hello world, and once we call it, for everyone is clear that somehow there's lines of codes who help us to write and print to the standard output, the hello world, without us needing to actually have the code here. So it helps us organizing the code. Another function is the reusability. Since we only have to define the function once, we and can call it wherever in the code at a position we want to call it, we can reuse these lines of code without having to write the same code again. So we declare the function once with the lines of code needed for the operations we want to achieve with it, and then we can call it wherever we want. We can reuse these lines of codes. So this helps us basically to minimize failure rates because every time we have to retype it or copy and paste it somewhere is a potential factor of errors because we humans do errors. So if we minimize the code, we don't repeat ourselves, everything we need twice, we only declare once and then call only the function, we minimize the error rate because when there's an error, in this operation, we only have one single source of line of code we need to change because there must be the error, and then every other function which needs these lines of codes and where we call those functions should work directly. We already used functions, maybe while knowing it, maybe without knowing it. For example, lists and range were both functions. Lists was a function. List was a function who made us a list in Python, and range was this function where we could build the numbers from 1 to 10 or from 1 to 100, basically already built-in function. If we couldn't use those built-in functions, which are already there in the standard application of Python, we would need to write code, which basically is a loop and then iterates through numbers and then somehow generates them. But range does this, does all those operations automatically. This is the power of functions. We usually can identify functions by the round brackets used because there's a function name, then there are those two brackets, and this basically says this is a function. This is true for Python, but would be true as well for Java, JavaScript, and so on. Most of programming language use those indicators for a function. Sometimes they're empty, sometimes there's something written in it. We know that that we put in list the range, and in range we had the starting value, the end value, and the step function. So basically, this is already a function where there's something standing in those brackets. So now let's dive into functions and look how we can apply them. Okay, shall we? So how do we start? Let's define a function for starters. And what do we do? Usually when we turn ourselves to function, every time we learn programming, we start with hello world, as I already introduced in the beginning, I guess. So let's try to write a function called hello world, which should only achieve that hello world is put to the standard output. So the idea is that when and wherever we will call the function, hello world is printed. This is the whole idea. To achieve this, we first have to define a function who would do those commands, those operations. Let's say performs this operation, these operations. In example, printing hello world. Okay, so this is our first task we have to do. Once we declared this function, we can use it somewhere else, and then the operations within the function should just happen. So how do we declare a function? In Python, usually if we declare something, so we define something for the first time, for example, a function, we use def for define in the beginning of what we do. So def tells Python, if we write that out, that we now declare something, for example, a function. And if we want to declare a function, we can call it whatever, brackets open and brackets closed, and now Python knows there should be a function. In our case, the logical name for the function is not ABC, it's my first function, or it could be hello world, whatever you want to call it, so that you later on know what to do. And by a double point again, we now declare what operations should follow once the function will be called later on. So, for example, if we write print and then hello world, exclamation mark, that's all we need to do. So what happens here? We define a function, because we have these brackets, which we will then, which we give a name, for example, my first function. And after we declare this, so these 2 lines of code are processed by the program, the function is now public knowledge to the program which we've written. So at any point later in the code, because computers are stupid, they go line from line to line to line, from top to bottom. So it starts somewhere on top, then it goes to the next line, next line, next line, next line to the bottom. This is how programs function. And if I would rerun the program, it would again start from top. So, but once this function is now public knowledge, so my first function, and we declared it, later in the code, so all lines below that, the function is known to the code, and we can call the function. And when we call it, the operations within the function we declared are then processed. So the operations within the function are, in our case, that hello world, the string with exclamation mark, will be printed. So if we hit play and everything works out, there's no error, the function is now knowledge. And if we then, in a later line of code, would call the function, okay, now that it is declared, we can call it. We now can call the function by just typing my first function, because that's the name of the function, brackets opened, brackets closed, and that's all we need to do. This line then calls this function, and the program code knows, okay, this function has the operations print hello world. So by getting to this line, we do the operation here. So let's test it. Hello world. It worked. And we can now do this, over. So this I didn't want to do. Over and over again, and now it should be printed 4 times. Hello world, hello world, hello world. We could as well say, okay, we can couple several operations. We, for example, could write here print hello classmates. And now every time we call the function, there's printed, first it will be printed hello world, then it will be printed hello classmates. Since we call the function 4 times, it should now be 8 lines below here. Hello world, hello classmates, hello world, hello classmates, hello world, hello classmates, and so on. You get the idea. Okay, so that worked out great. We now know how to declare a function. We now know how to call a function. And this is basically exactly the reusability. We declare it once, we can use it as often as we want to. And in such a function, a loop could be as well. So we could put it in a function as well, and so on, call a loop. So we could basically give it a list, and then it would process something. So far, what we did is we used a function, and in this function, an operation was done directly. However, sometimes we need a function which does something and then gives us something back, which we then can use to work on. For example, we want a calculation, or let's say list. If you perform list, brackets open, brackets closed, and somewhere something in those brackets so that this will be the list. What happens is that moment rewrite list, brackets open, bracket closed, we get a list back. At that point, we call the function and can process with that result. So we can do something with that. Or if we want to do a calculation, let's say we would have a function which would add 2 numbers. With that sum of those 2 numbers, we might want to further do some calculations. So at the point we call my first function, for example, it could be that afterwards we want to use that string hello world to do something with it, to change it. To do that, we need the function to return something to us. This is what we call a return. And we could make this that where we call the function, we get from the function in return, for example, the string hello world. So let's look how this works with return. So what we do want to make now is the hello world function that returns a string containing hello world. No, exactly, it should contain hello world exclamation mark, as we always do. So we then we have to define again a function by def, function name. Now let's call this the hello world string. Since it returns a string containing hello world. Brackets open, brackets closed, double point, and now what we need is a string containing hello world exclamation mark. And how do we get it in return? Exactly, rewrite return in front of it. And as you can see by the purple color, this is standard thing. This now tells us once we call that function, we get that in return. Okay? And now at some different point after the declaration, so here we declare it, so in lines of codes below that, we can use the function hello world string. So since we get a string back, we could just print it somewhere by calling the function inside the print function hello world string, exactly, brackets open, brackets close. And now what happens at that point in the code, we call the function hello world string, which gives us exactly this back. So here, instead of hello world brackets open brackets close stands somehow hello world in the string format. Exactly. There it is. Once we run it, we see hello world as a string in the output. Great. Okay, what have we learned? We learned how to declare a function, how to call a function, that the function can do operations or can give us something in return, which we then can use as a variable or whatever it gives us back to do something with it. Calculations, printing, whatever. So it can do something or give us something back. What if it needs something to process that? For example, we have numbers and we want to say, oh, well, what's the sum of that? What's the modulo operation of that? Whatever. In that cases, we need to give something to function as variables. The function can use those variables we give it, process it, and return something back or does something with that. We did that already. Remember the range function. The range function, brackets open, brackets close, and there's a start value, an end value, and a step value. Those are variables, values we give the function. It then takes processing in to give us numbers back from the start value to the end value in a certain step. In certain steps. So exactly that we can now apply and look how that works. For example, if we make a function which adds numbers together, so makes the sum of two numbers, basically a small addition function. It's already built in Python by just typing number A plus number B. So we don't actually need to program it, but it's a good exercise to learn how telling a function values works. Okay. What do we then need to do? We want to make a function making the addition of two numbers. So adding two numbers. So let's first define the function which we need. Or let's just think about what we will need. So we want to have number A plus number 2 should result in, or let's say different, make a hashtag here in before. If we want to add 1 and 2, we want the result 3. So this is basically variable A, this is basically variable B, and then we want this in return, so the sum of those two. Okay, so we do already know that we want in return A plus B. Sorry, A plus B. So the function should return that. And for returning 1 plus 2 or A plus B, it needs both variables. It needs variable A, so what is the number left side of the plus and what's the number right and the right side of the plus. So what we need is basically a function which we now call addition, and this function in return gives A plus B. To perform that, it needs both the variable A and the variable B. So all the factors or variables or objects it needs to perform its operation, in that case A plus B, we tell in those brackets already to the function, okay, you expect two variables. Okay? So once we did this, we have declared the function which adds two numbers, in example number A and number B, with that. Now we can test it. So let's print addition. And now this function, which we now call, needs two numbers. For example, 1 and 2, which should result in 3, right? So let's test it. 3. Great. And now let's try that again to be really sure that it works. Let's make 5 plus 3 should be 8. Sorry, comma 8. Great. Works quite all right. So I now have a small exercise for you. And with that exercise, we close the basics of Python. This is now the following exercise. So I'm asking you to make a function who gets a value in kilometers. So values we use in almost all around the world, but in particular the USA and 2 other countries I think in the world are still using miles and stuff like that, in yards and feet and inches. So for those, if I want to tell them a distance in kilometers, they don't get it. So I need a converter who converts those distances into miles. So I want you to write that. Write a function who gets a value in kilometers and calculates how many miles this is. You could Google how you calculate this, but I can tell you to get from kilometers to miles, you have to divide the kilometers by 1.60934, as you can see. Have fun, and I will show you the solution in the next video.